The German E-boat flotilla's twin diesel engines were running silent at 0347 hours when Seaman First Class Anthony, Cookie, Martinelli realized his grandmother's Sunday gravy recipe was either going to save the Allied convoy from a coordinated torpedo attack that would send 12 merchant ships to the bottom of the English Channel, or get every man aboard USS Fletcher killed by Captain Lieutenant Hans C. Wolf Kruger's elite Schnellboot Squadron, the deadliest fast attack craft in the entire Kriegsmarine. Cookie, they're out there. Radioman Second Class Danny O'Sullivan whispered from his watch position as the German E-boats crept through the pre-dawn darkness off the coast of Dover, where Kruger's flotilla had been systematically hunting Allied shipping with stealth tactics that had sunk 47 vessels without suffering a single loss during 6 months of nocturnal warfare. The tactical situation was desperate according to every naval doctrine that mattered in convoy warfare. Kruger's 6S-100 class E-boats could achieve 43 knots maximum speed and carried twin 20mm cannons plus 4 533mm torpedoes each, creating a combined firepower advantage that could overwhelm any convoy escort through coordinated night attacks that struck from multiple directions simultaneously. USS Fletcher was a Benson-class destroyer with sophisticated radar equipment, but E-boats were specifically designed to defeat Allied detection systems using muffled exhaust systems and low-profile hulls that made them nearly invisible during night operations. The mathematical reality was brutal. 6 German fast attack craft versus 1 American destroyer meant certain death for the merchant convoy unless something unexpected disrupted German tactical coordination. But what the legendary German naval commander didn't know was that Anthony Martinelli had grown up in his Italian grandmother's kitchen in Brooklyn's Red Hook neighborhood, where Nana Rosa had taught him that the smell of good cooking could make men do stupid things, and sometimes the best way to catch dangerous predators was to make them forget about hunting long enough to think about eating. "Danny, trust me on this," Cookie shouted as he worked frantically in USS Fletcher's galley, using his grandmother's secret ingredients to create an aroma that would either lure the German E-boats into a fatal tactical mistake or provide the last meal that any American sailor would ever taste. The recipe that would change everything had been passed down through 4 generations of Martinelli women who understood that food was about more than nutrition. It was about memory, desire, and the kind of hunger that could make rational men abandon good judgment when their stomachs overruled their brains during moments when survival depended on maintaining tactical discipline. Cookie's galley aboard USS Fletcher was equipped with standard Navy cooking equipment that had been designed for efficiency rather than flavor, but Cookie had learned to adapt his grandmother's recipes using military ingredients and improvised techniques that could create maximum aroma using minimal resources. The secret was understanding how certain spice combinations could travel long distances on night air and trigger psychological responses that bypassed rational thinking. The specific aromatics that Cookie was preparing included fresh garlic that had been smuggled aboard during their last port call, onions from the ship's stores, dried basil and oregano that Cookie had acquired through trading with other ship's cooks, and canned tomatoes that could be transformed into something resembling his grandmother's Sunday gravy through techniques that Rosa Martinelli had taught him for stretching ingredients during the Great Depression. If stories of family traditions and unlikely naval victories move you, hit that subscribe button. These accounts show what happens when Brooklyn cooking meets German naval precision, proving that sometimes the deadliest weapons are the simplest applications of human nature that enemies never see coming. The unstoppable German wolf pack that ruled the night had established its reputation through 18 months of channel warfare that had produced 47 confirmed kills without losing a single E-boat to Allied forces, making Captain Lieutenant Hans Kruger the most feared fast attack commander in the European theater of operations and the personal nemesis of Royal Navy convoy escorts throughout the English Channel. Kruger was 31 years old, a career Kriegsmarine officer who had commanded Schnellboots since the 1940 invasion of Norway and had developed tactical methods that maximized the E-boat's advantages in speed, stealth, and firepower through coordinated night attacks that struck Allied convoys before defensive forces could respond effectively. Hans had earned his naval commission through the prestigious German Naval Academy and had studied under the legendary Admiral Karl Donitz, who had taught him that naval warfare was about psychology as much as firepower. The German E-boat flotilla consisted of 6 100-class vessels, each representing the pinnacle of German naval engineering and designed specifically for high-speed night operations against Allied shipping in the confined waters of the English Channel. Each vessel displaced 105 tons, measured 115 feet in length, and could achieve maximum speeds of 43 knots using twin Mercedes-Benz diesel engines that had been specially modified for reduced noise signature during stealth approaches. The armament of each E-boat included twin 20mm Oerlikon cannons that could destroy unarmored merchant vessels with sustained fire, plus 4 533mm torpedoes that were identical to those used by German U-boats and capable of sinking any Allied vessel with direct hits. More importantly, the E-boats carried advanced radio equipment that allowed Krüger to coordinate simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, overwhelming convoy defenses through tactical complexity that conventional escort vessels couldn't counter. Hans Krüger had earned his nickname, Sea Wolf, through his ability to appear suddenly from the darkness, coordinate devastating torpedo attacks against Allied shipping, then disappear before Royal Navy destroyers could mount effective counterattacks using their superior firepower. Krüger's tactical philosophy was based on pack hunting principles that used multiple E-boats to overwhelm convoy defenses through simultaneous attacks from different directions that divided Allied defensive fire and created opportunities for torpedo launches. Krüger's combat record was legendary throughout the Kriegsmarine and had become the standard by which other fast attack commanders measured their effectiveness. 47 confirmed merchant vessel kills totaling over 300,000 tons of Allied shipping, including the destruction of 3 Royal Navy destroyers that had attempted to engage his flotilla during previous convoy battles. More significantly, Krüger had never lost an E-boat during combat operations, creating a reputation for invincibility that demoralized Allied naval personnel throughout the Channel theater. Convoy bearing 270, range 8,000 meters, Krüger announced to his flotilla through encrypted radio communications as the German E-boats positioned themselves for the coordinated attack that would sink 12 Allied merchant ships within 15 minutes using tactics that had proven successful during 18 months of nocturnal warfare. Standard attack formation. Execute on my command. Tonight we will send more British tonnage to the bottom. Krüger's E-boat S-130 was the flotilla flagship, equipped with enhanced navigation equipment that included the latest German radar technology, improved communication systems that allowed precise coordination of multi-vessel attacks in darkness conditions where visual contact between German boats was impossible, and upgraded engines that provided additional speed for escape maneuvers. The tactical advantage of coordinated E-boat operations had proven devastating against Allied convoys that were designed to defend against submarine attacks rather than high-speed surface raiders. The psychological impact of Krüger's reputation was as devastating as his tactical effectiveness, because Allied convoy crews throughout the English Channel understood that encountering the Sea Wolf meant facing an opponent whose coordination and timing had never failed during night operations. Radio intercepts had revealed that merchant marine officers would request course changes to avoid areas where Krüger's flotilla had been reported, creating tactical advantages that extended far beyond individual engagements. But Krüger had never faced an opponent like Anthony Martinelli, whose understanding of human psychology and Italian cooking was about to prove that sometimes military precision could be defeated by forces that operated on instinct rather than doctrine when properly applied by someone who understood how hunger could override tactical discipline during critical moments when concentration meant the difference between life and death. The Brooklyn cook who understood hunger had grown up during the Great Depression in an Italian immigrant family where food represented survival, community, and the kind of cultural identity that sustained families through hardships that threatened to destroy their connection to the homeland they'd left behind for the promise of American opportunity. Anthony Martinelli was 24 years old, the grandson of Italian immigrants who had arrived in New York in 1902 and established a small restaurant in Red Hook that served the longshoremen and factory workers who kept Brooklyn's waterfront operating. Cookie's grandmother, Rosa Martinelli, had learned cooking from her mother in Sicily and had adapted traditional recipes to American ingredients while maintaining the essential flavors that reminded Italian families of home during the difficult years of cultural assimilation. Rosa Martinelli had survived the poverty of early immigration by understanding that food was a weapon against despair and homesickness, creating meals that could transport people back to Sicily through taste and aroma even when they were surrounded by the industrial grid of Brooklyn's waterfront. Her restaurant had become a gathering place for Italian immigrants who needed to remember who they were beneath the pressure to become American as quickly as possible. Anthony, Nana Rosa had said while teaching him the secrets of her Sunday gravy recipe that could fill a tenement building with aromas that made grown men weep with homesickness, her hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had cooked for survival rather than pleasure. You cook with the nose first, then the tongue. When people smell the good food, they forget everything else. Even the smart ones, they become stupid when they smell what they want. The specific technique that would save the Allied convoy had been developed by Rosa Martinelli during the lean years of the 1930s, when she had learned to stretch ingredients and create maximum aroma using minimal resources while feeding families who couldn't afford restaurant meals but needed the psychological comfort that only traditional cooking could provide. The secret was understanding how certain spice combinations could travel long distances on night air and trigger psychological responses that bypassed rational thinking. Rosa's Sunday gravy was legendary throughout Red Hook for its ability to attract customers from blocks away, drawing Italian families who hadn't been able to afford restaurant meals for months but couldn't resist the smell of garlic, onions, and herbs that reminded them of their mothers cooking in the old country. The recipe included specific ratios of aromatic vegetables that maximized scent projection while creating flavor complexity that satisfied deep psychological hungers for cultural connection. Cookie had enlisted in the Navy in 1942 immediately after Pearl Harbor, despite having a civilian job at the Brooklyn Navy Yard that would have kept him safely stateside throughout the war, contributing to ship construction that was considered essential to the American war effort. But Cookie couldn't stand the thought of other men fighting for American freedom while he stayed home cooking for dock workers, even though his culinary skills were desperately needed for civilian morale and war production. Naval training at Great Lakes had been challenging for Cookie because military cooking was about efficiency and nutrition rather than flavor and tradition, requiring him to learn techniques that prioritized speed and portion control over the careful attention to aroma and taste that his grandmother had taught him. But Cookie had quickly discovered that his ability to improve Navy food could boost crew morale and maintain fighting spirit during the long months of convoy duty that tested sailors' endurance. The transition from civilian cooking to military service had revealed that Cookie's greatest talent wasn't following recipes but understanding how food affected human psychology and behavior. He had learned to read crew morale through their responses to different meals and had developed techniques for using flavor and aroma to maintain fighting spirit when conventional military leadership methods failed to motivate exhausted sailors. Martinelli, the ship's executive officer, had said after Cookie's first Sunday dinner had eliminated the disciplinary problems that had plagued the crew during their previous Atlantic crossing, his voice reflecting the amazement of a career naval officer who had never seen food used as a tool for crew management. "I don't know what you put in that sauce, but keep doing it. I've never seen sailors work harder or complain less than they do after eating your cooking." But the real test of Cookie's culinary wisdom had come when USS Fletcher was assigned to convoy escort duty in the English Channel, where German E-boats had been systematically destroying Allied merchant shipping using stealth tactics that conventional naval doctrine had proven unable to counter effectively. Cookie had realized that his understanding of human psychology through food could be applied to warfare if he could find ways to use cooking aromas as weapons against enemy morale and tactical discipline. The inspiration for using food as psychological warfare had come from Cookie's observation that German prisoners of war became emotional when they smelled real cooking, breaking down psychologically when confronted with aromas that reminded them of civilian life and family connections that had been severed by years of military service. Cookie had begun to understand that hunger was a universal vulnerability that could be exploited regardless of nationality or military training. The deadly night that almost ended everything began when Allied intelligence intercepted German radio traffic indicating that Kruger's E-boat flotilla was positioning for a major attack against convoy HX 347, which included 12 merchant vessels carrying critical supplies for the upcoming invasion of France, including ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and the specialized equipment that would be essential for establishing beachheads on the Norman coast. USS Fletcher had been assigned as the convoy's lead escort destroyer, responsible for detecting and engaging German surface raiders before they could attack the vulnerable merchant ships that represented months of American industrial production and the accumulated resources necessary for the liberation of Western Europe. But the Fletcher's radar equipment was primitive by modern standards, and E-boats were specifically designed to avoid detection during night operations when visual contact was impossible. The tactical situation facing Captain James Morrison aboard USS Fletcher was essentially hopeless according to conventional naval doctrine, because 6 German E-boats operating in coordinated formation could overwhelm a single destroyer through simultaneous attacks from multiple directions that would divide American defensive fire and create opportunities for torpedo launches that could sink the merchant convoy before Fletcher could neutralize the German threat. Captain Morrison had fought German surface raiders throughout the European campaign and understood that E-boat tactics were based on speed, stealth, and coordination that maximized German advantages while minimizing Allied opportunities for effective response. The mathematical reality was brutal. Kruger's flotilla could launch 24 torpedoes in a coordinated salvo that would destroy the entire merchant convoy regardless of Fletcher's defensive capabilities. Cookie had been preparing the midnight meal for the Fletcher's crew when general quarters sounded and every man aboard the destroyer rushed to battle stations, transforming the peaceful routine of convoy escort into the deadly preparation for naval combat that could determine the fate of 12 merchant vessels and their crews. The galley was officially closed during combat operations, but Cookie had learned that feeding sailors was sometimes more important than following regulations, especially during the long hours of tension that preceded enemy contact. "Cookie, get below and secure the galley," Chief Petty Officer Murphy had shouted as the Fletcher's crew prepared for action against an enemy that could appear anywhere in the darkness surrounding the convoy, his voice carrying the authority of a career sailor who had learned that survival depended on following proper procedures during combat operations. "We're going into a shooting war, and the last thing we need is fires in the galley when the Germans start shooting." But Cookie had an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on how well he understood the psychology of German sailors who had been at sea for weeks without tasting anything that reminded them of home, family, or the civilian life that had been sacrificed for military service. Instead of securing the galley according to regulations, Cookie began preparing his grandmother's Sunday gravy using every aromatic ingredient he could find in the ship's stores. The inspiration for Cookie's psychological warfare plan had come from his observation that captured German sailors became emotional when exposed to real cooking aromas, breaking down psychologically when confronted with smells that triggered memories of civilian life and family connections that had been severed by years of military service and combat operations. Cookie had realized that hunger was a universal vulnerability that transcended nationality and military training. The psychology of hunger that would save everything was based on Cookie's understanding that German sailors were human beings who missed their families and their homeland just as much as American sailors did, creating psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood how food aromas triggered emotional responses that bypassed military discipline. Cookie had learned from talking to German prisoners that Wehrmacht rations were notorious for their poor quality and complete lack of flavor, creating hunger for real food that had been suppressed but never eliminated. "If I can make them hungry enough," Cookie muttered to himself as he began browning onions and garlic using techniques his grandmother had taught him for maximizing aroma production while working within the constraints of military equipment and ingredients. "Maybe they'll forget about being professional killers long enough to make a mistake that gets them killed instead of us." The recipe that Cookie was preparing included ingredients that had been carefully selected for their ability to travel long distances on night air while creating psychological responses that would compromise German tactical discipline: fresh garlic that triggered memories of home cooking, onions that created the foundation for aromatic complexity, basil and oregano that carried cultural associations with civilian comfort, and tomatoes that provided the base for flavors that reminded European sailors of peacetime meals with their families. But the real secret was timing and wind direction, because Cookie had learned from the Fletcher's weather reports that the prevailing wind was blowing from the convoy toward the suspected German positions, creating atmospheric conditions that would carry cooking aromas directly toward Kruger's E-boats if the recipe was prepared at exactly the right moment when German crews were focused on final attack preparations. The moment that changed everything came at 0355 hours when Cookie's Sunday gravy reached the perfect aromatic intensity and the night wind began carrying the smell of garlic, onions, and herbs across 3 miles of English Channel darkness directly toward the German E-boat flotilla that was preparing to attack the Allied convoy using coordination and timing that had never failed during 18 months of nocturnal warfare. "Mein Gott, do you smell that?" Oberbootsman Karl Weber whispered aboard Kruger's flagship as the aroma of Cookie's cooking reached the German E-boats and triggered memories of home cooking that none of the crew had experienced in months of wartime service, creating psychological responses that challenged their ability to maintain tactical focus during the critical minutes before attack initiation. Kruger had been focusing on final attack preparations when the unmistakable smell of Italian cooking reached his nostrils and created a psychological distraction that challenged his ability to maintain tactical concentration. The aroma reminded him of a small restaurant in Naples where he had eaten during shore leave in 1941, before the war had consumed every aspect of his life and reduced existence to kill or be killed calculations that left no room for civilian memories or emotional connections. The psychological impact of Cookie's cooking was intensifying throughout the German flotilla as the aroma continued to spread across the water, triggering homesickness and hunger responses that had been suppressed during months of military service but never eliminated from human psychology. The smell of real garlic and herbs was creating memories of family dinners, civilian restaurants, and the kind of food that existed only in peacetime when cooking was about pleasure rather than survival. Concentrate on the mission. Kruger commanded his crew as the smell of garlic and herbs continued to intensify, creating hunger pangs that were difficult to ignore after weeks of eating nothing but Wehrmacht field rations that tasted like cardboard soaked in grease and provided nutrition without any psychological satisfaction. The attack begins in 2 minutes regardless of whatever the Americans are cooking. But the psychological impact of Cookie's Sunday gravy was affecting every German sailor in the flotilla, creating hunger and homesickness that undermined the focus and discipline that were essential for successful night attack operations against defended convoys. The smell of real food was triggering memories of civilian life that had been suppressed during months of military service and combat operations that reduced human existence to mechanical functions without emotional content. The German E-boat crews had been living on care rations and preserved foods that provided nutrition but no psychological satisfaction for men who were far from home and facing death every night during convoy hunting operations that required total concentration and perfect coordination. The aroma of Cookie's cooking represented everything they had sacrificed for the war effort: family, comfort, and the simple pleasure of eating food that was prepared with care rather than efficiency. "The smell is coming from bearing 285, reported the lookout aboard E-boat S-127 as Cookie's cooking continued to intensify and create hunger responses that were becoming impossible to ignore despite military training that was designed to suppress such distractions during combat operations. It smells like my mother's kitchen before the war, when we had real food instead of military garbage." Kruger realized that his flotilla's concentration was being compromised by psychological factors that no tactical manual had prepared them to handle, but he couldn't postpone the attack without losing the element of surprise that was essential for E-boat operations against defended convoys. The mission had to proceed regardless of whatever cooking was affecting his crew's morale and focus, because delaying the attack would allow Allied escorts to detect German positions and mount effective defensive responses. The vulnerability that Cookie's cooking was exploiting had been created by months of military service that had isolated German sailors from civilian life and family connections, creating psychological hunger for normal human experiences that military discipline could suppress but never eliminate. The aroma of real cooking was attacking German morale at its weakest point, the universal human need for comfort and connection that transcended nationality and military training. "All boats, execute attack run now." Kruger commanded as his E-boats began their approach toward the Allied convoy, but the psychological distraction created by Cookie's Sunday gravy had already planted seeds of tactical hesitation that would prove fatal to German coordination and timing during the critical minutes when precise execution meant the difference between success and disaster. The mistake that doomed everything happened when Oberbootsman Weber aboard S-127 allowed his attention to drift toward the source of the cooking aroma instead of maintaining proper lookout discipline during the attack approach. creating a momentary lapse in tactical awareness that caused him to miss the American destroyer USS Fletcher's change in position as the ship maneuvered to investigate the German E-boats that had been detected through their radio communications. Weber's psychological distraction was representative of what was happening throughout the German flotilla as Cookie's cooking continued to trigger hunger responses and homesickness that compromised tactical discipline during the most critical phase of the attack when perfect coordination was essential for success. The smell of garlic and herbs was creating emotional responses that bypassed military training and challenged German professional competence at exactly the moment when tactical precision meant survival. American destroyer, bearing 090, range 2,000 meters. Weber suddenly shouted as he realized that Fletcher was much closer than German intelligence had calculated, creating a tactical situation where the E-boats were exposed to American naval gunfire before they could launch their torpedoes at the merchant convoy, reversing the tactical advantage that had made Kruger's flotilla invincible during 18 months of night operations. American destroyer, bearing 090, range 2,000 meters. Weber suddenly shouted as he realized that Fletcher was much closer than German intelligence had calculated, creating a tactical situation where the E-boats were exposed to American naval gunfire before they could launch their torpedoes at the merchant convoy. Cookie's psychological warfare had created exactly the kind of tactical confusion that conventional naval doctrine couldn't achieve against professional German sailors who had been trained to ignore distractions and maintain focus during combat operations. But hunger was a force more primitive than military training, and Cookie's grandmother's recipe had weaponized homesickness against enemy morale. The naval battle that followed was swift, decisive, and devastating for Kruger's E-boat flotilla. Fletcher's 5-inch guns opened fire at point-blank range against German boats that had been caught in disorganized formation due to the psychological distraction created by Cookie's Sunday gravy, eliminating the coordination and timing that were essential for successful E-boat operations. "We are under fire," Kruger shouted as American shells began striking his flotilla with accuracy that indicated the Germans had lost the element of surprise that was their primary tactical advantage against superior Allied firepower. All boats scatter and attack independently. But Cookie's cooking had already achieved its psychological objective by disrupting German concentration and coordination at the critical moment when tactical precision was essential for survival against American naval gunfire that was designed to destroy fast attack craft before they could launch torpedoes at defended convoys. The aftermath of the Battle of the Aromatic Ambush, as it would later be called in unofficial Navy records, resulted in the destruction of 4 German E-boats and the capture of 2 others, including Kruger's flagship S-130, marking the first time in 18 months of Channel warfare that an entire German E-boat flotilla had been neutralized without inflicting casualties on Allied shipping or achieving any of their tactical objectives. Martinelli, Fletcher's captain, said during the post-battle debriefing, his voice carrying the amazement of an experienced officer who had witnessed something that challenged every assumption about naval warfare and psychological manipulation, "I've been fighting Germans for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened tonight." How do you explain defeating the most successful E-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine using cooking instead of naval gunfire? Cookie's answer became part of American naval folklore and established psychological warfare through cooking as a legitimate tactical technique that was immediately classified by naval intelligence and studied by psychological warfare specialists throughout the Allied forces. "Captain, my grandmother always said that hunger makes smart men stupid, and homesickness makes brave men careless." Those Germans hadn't tasted real food in months, and when they smelled what they were missing, they forgot about killing us long enough for us to kill them first. The tactical innovation that Cookie had demonstrated under pressure was immediately classified by naval intelligence and became the subject of psychological warfare studies that examined how sensory manipulation could be used to disrupt enemy concentration during critical operations, leading to the development of formal doctrine that incorporated environmental psychology as a weapon against enemy morale and tactical discipline. Within 48 hours of Kruger's defeat, naval intelligence officers were interviewing Cookie about the specific technical details of his cooking technique, creating classified studies that analyzed how aroma projection could be used to compromise enemy psychological readiness during combat operations. The techniques were never officially adopted due to their unpredictable nature, but individual ships began experimenting with similar approaches to psychological warfare. But the most significant impact was on German E-boat operations throughout the remainder of the war, because Kruger's defeat had demonstrated that even the most professional naval crews could be psychologically compromised through techniques that exploited basic human needs for comfort and connection to civilian life. Radio intercepts revealed that German naval commanders throughout the Channel were reporting concerns about American sensory warfare and requesting intelligence about Allied capabilities for psychological manipulation. The ripple effects of Cookie's victory extended throughout German naval operations as word spread that the legendary Sea Wolf had been defeated by American cooking rather than superior firepower, creating doubts about Kriegsmarine invulnerability that affected morale throughout German fast attack units and reduced the tactical aggressiveness that had been the hallmark of E-boat operations since the beginning of the war. German naval intelligence began investigating Allied psychological warfare capabilities and issued warnings about the potential for enemy forces to use sensory manipulation as a weapon against German tactical discipline, leading to changes in operational procedures that reduced E-boat effectiveness during night operations when crews were instructed to ignore environmental distractions that might compromise mission focus. The psychological impact of Kruger's defeat was amplified by the fact that it had been achieved through techniques that German tactical doctrine had never anticipated or prepared to counter, demonstrating that Allied innovation could neutralize German advantages through creative applications of civilian knowledge rather than superior military technology or conventional naval tactics. Kruger himself never commanded another naval vessel after his capture, spending the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war who provided intelligence about German tactical doctrine while struggling to understand how American cooking had defeated 18 months of successful combat operations and professional military expertise that had never failed during previous engagements with Allied forces. The scientific explanation for Cookie's success revealed the sophisticated understanding of human psychology and sensory manipulation that had been developed through generations of Italian cooking traditions, demonstrating that civilian knowledge could be weaponized against military targets when applied by someone who understood how basic human needs could override professional training during moments of psychological vulnerability. Young Martinelli understood something about human psychology that our naval tacticians had never considered, explained Dr. Margaret Foster from the Navy's Bureau of Medicine during a classified post-war analysis of the incident. By exploiting the universal human response to food aromas, he created psychological conditions that compromised German tactical discipline at exactly the moment when concentration was essential for mission success. The post-war analysis of Cookie's technique revealed that psychological warfare through sensory manipulation represented a form of environmental combat that had never been formally studied by military psychologists but proved highly effective when applied by soldiers who understood human psychology and emotional vulnerabilities that transcended nationality and military training. The human story that made it all meaningful was preserved in letters between Cookie and his grandmother, documenting not just the technical details of Italian cooking but the family wisdom and cultural traditions that had enabled a Brooklyn boy to defeat German naval precision through understanding of human psychology that transcended military doctrine and proved that civilian knowledge could become military weapons when applied with creativity and understanding of universal human needs. Nana, Cookie wrote in a letter from Europe after the E-boat battle, "I used your Sunday gravy recipe to catch German boats instead of Italian boys. Turns out that hungry sailors are the same everywhere. When they smell good cooking, they forget about everything else, even war. Your cooking saved 12 ships and maybe 1,000 men tonight." Rosa Martinelli's response revealed the connection between family tradition and survival that had sustained immigrant families through generations of challenges that required innovative solutions to problems that conventional approaches couldn't solve. "Anthony, I told you that good cooking makes people stupid with wanting. You used their wanting against them, just like I taught you. Food is about more than eating, it's about what people miss when they're far from home, and you made them miss home so much they forgot about war." Cookie Martinelli proved that naval warfare could be influenced by factors that had nothing to do with firepower or technology when human psychology was properly understood and exploited by someone who knew how to weaponize homesickness against enemy morale and tactical discipline. So here's the question Cookie's story poses: when facing professional military opponents, how do you find weaknesses in their psychological armor rather than their physical defenses? What drives a Navy cook to trust his grandmother's wisdom about human nature more than naval doctrine when lives depend on unconventional thinking? And how do family traditions become military weapons when applied with creativity and understanding of universal human needs? Cookie Martinelli proved that sometimes the most effective naval tactic is not superior firepower but superior understanding of what makes enemy sailors human, combined with the culinary wisdom to exploit their humanity when they least expect it.